from the Settle group of friends, and we have 3 representatives of the Friends Meeting House here in Settle. We've got John and Sue and Marion. I don't know what order you're going to go into, but I'd love to invite you up and to say a very big thank you for the preparation that you've done in putting this presentation together. And there's going to be lots of opportunity to discuss, and have questions. And so don't worry, I'll ask for some feedback again soon. So over to John and Sue and Marion. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Sue, and thank you, friends, for inviting us. We're going to begin by each of us briefly sharing something from our experience of Quaker peace work. And then we will each cover a peace education topic in a short workshop and end with questions and discussion. So I'm going to start off with my piece on peace experience. Now, all Quakers, I think it's fair to say, have a core belief in the central importance of peace. But yet the paths that we take in response to that belief do differ between individuals and at different times. Now, perhaps perversely, I'm going to start with Quaker reactions to war rather than peace. Back in 2014, I worked with others to research how local Quakers and Quakers nationally responded to the outbreak of the First World War, and later in 1916 to conscription. And those men who were not exempt from military service had 3 alternatives. They could refuse absolutely to take any part in or give any support to the war. Short of that, different from that, they could accept a supporting role short of taking up weapons. And these jobs that they would be assigned to were in the medical area, in construction or agriculture or the like. Or they could sign up for active service. Now, the background to this conflict was tragically similar to Ukraine today. Neutral Belgium had been cruelly overrun and really terrible massacres and atrocities committed by the German army. And the British public, and I hope other countries too, were absolutely horrified. And against this, Quakers had to decide how they individually might best serve the cause of peace. Now, these were big decisions, life and death decisions. But the men didn't have to rely solely on their own discernment. In Quaker worship and in business meetings, they could seek God's will individually and collectively through listening. And the results, the decisions that they took varied by place. In Settle, all 7 COs were Quakers, as it happened, and all of them signed up to give non-violent support to the military in the conflict or through other war-related efforts. Bentham was totally different. A higher proportion of the population was Quaker, and there was a substantial union membership. There, in small Bentham, as it were, 30 COs were registered, of whom some served as non-combatants in France, but 9 spent between 2 and 3 years in prison. Now, of all the UK Quakers eligible to fight in the First World War, it's estimated that 1/3 were absolutist COs, absolutist conscientious objectors, and resisted. And they were imprisoned with hard labor, and it was hard labor. Some were threatened with execution, some died from their treatment. And the absolutist COs discerned that the cause of peace was best served by their witness. Another 1/3 claimed conscientious objector status, but were willing to work to support the war effort non-violently. in many cases in the front line, where a number died. A settled Quaker was awarded the Croix de Guerre. The non-combatant COs were not cowards. They felt that their testimony to non-violence was absolute, but justice would best be served by supporting the armed forces. The remaining third signed up as soldiers to fight to push back the German army, seeing justice as a necessary precursor to peace. And I often asked myself through that time which third I would have been in. And that's mighty difficult. I do believe really, really strongly in justice, and in particular in safeguarding those who are oppressed. And if after everything else had been tried, it needed force to stop the atrocities, I might have been prepared to volunteer and even to fight if necessary to restore conditions for peace. Now I'll pass on to Sue.
So how did I come to be part of a peace church? I'm going to just read this so that I don't go wending off. I was brought up a Methodist, and in my childhood the nuclear arms race loomed large in the news. There were lots of protests going on. I personally concluded, though not everybody in my Methodist world agreed, that Jesus' message was unequivocally against all killing. So by my teenage years, at the end of the 70s, I had become a passionate advocate of nuclear disarmament, which basically meant wearing CND badges to school. But the Methodist Church did give me the opportunity for some peace activism, because the then president of conference, if anybody remembers Kenneth Greet, had set up a national petition campaigning for multilateral disarmament, although not all Methodists agreed with him either. At the time, my dad had temporarily persuaded me that multilateral was the way forward, that Britain shouldn't get rid of weapons by ourselves, which I agreed with for a while. So I took the petition around my whole school. And the Quakers came onto my radar around that time. They were quite visible in reports of protests and on all the demonstrations. And there was a meeting house in my town, and what I heard about them was that they were committed above all to peace, as well as to equality. So it was the so-called peace testimony that first drew me to the Quakers. And when I went away to university, I started attending a meeting. At first, I was simultaneously a member of the Student Christian Movement, the Anglican Methodist Society, and Leeds University Society of Theologians. Yes, that does spell lust, and we did have t-shirts. But it was with some of the young friends, the student Quaker group, that I would get on the coaches to women's anti-nuclear demonstrations at Greenham Common. None of those other groups were moved to that kind of peace activism. And in my 20s, I found myself living at a sister camp to Greenham in upstate New York. By now, as a feminist, I had taken leave of God like Don Cupid. By the way, my degree was theology. However, the peace camp was a place where women brought their spiritual traditions, and we practiced a spontaneous and eclectic mix of life-affirming rituals, drawing on our religious heritages and goddess traditions, both ancient and current. And there was lots of singing. Quakerly is the word I would use to describe our meetings and interactions. I think the Quaker tradition had had a big influence within the camp, and meetings were facilitated in ways that included silence and waiting, and above all, allowing time for every timid voice and inviting the timid to speak. And really listening. After that, I found there was room for me in the Quakers because there's no creed and no liturgy, so I can couch the spiritual dimension of my life in my own terms. I am, of course, primarily shaped by my Christian heritage. The values I learned in Sunday school are the ones that I live by now. And what I found unhelpful about the 1980s women's peace movement was that the world had divided into a very polarised one, where all that was nurturing and life-affirming was female, while warmongering was the domain of men. And it took me a long time to draw back from that separatist ideology. It's a very cynical place to inhabit. Certainly in the Quaker world, I feel able to safely assume that men are orientated to listening, negotiating, and peacemaking, while in other contexts I can't or don't always make that assumption.
Okay. So my peace testimony begins with my dad. My dad was a very gentle, peaceful man, and he taught us words like pacifism, and he also taught me the word warmongering, and he had a quite strong opinion on who the warmongers were as I was growing up, and he also had a very strong sense of social justice. So I was raised in a family with a very strong belief in social justice and a message in a sense that you had a responsibility to respond to social injustices. I first met Quakers, a bit like Sue, when I was in the sixth form, and I was taking part in a 12-hour fast in St Peter's Square in Manchester, as you do, and Quakers who are just along from there came and spoke to us and were very supportive, and as a group of young people having these adults kind of coming and supporting what we were doing felt very strong, felt important. I'm an absolutist, I believe. I believe Jesus was really clear in his teaching and his death that it's wrong to take another person's life. And I don't know how you solve conflicts, but that's a kind of absolute core belief for me, that that's what Jesus' teaching is, and that's what I would aspire to. My pacifism's led me to take part in numerous demonstrations over the years. But I didn't join Quakers because of the peace testimony. I think whatever faith tradition I was part of, I would have always been a peace activist. I would have always taken that stand. That's how I was raised. I came to Quakers really through Meeting for Worship. Our style of Meeting for Worship is something that completely delights me. And that's why I'm a Quaker. The thing that Quakers did teach me quite strongly, I was raised in a family where we argued a lot. We argued politics a lot, we still do. And it was a kind of I'm right, you're wrong sort of argument. You had to find the holes in the other person's argument. And two episodes come to mind where I was really taught the Quaker way of looking for God in the other person. The first one was on a Quaker expedition to Palestine in 2010. And we were taken to meet various peace activists, but we were also taken to what was an illegal settlement in Palestine, and we met with a man who was an American Israeli Jewish man who had moved from Chicago to be part of that illegal settlement in Palestine, and he was talking to us about the Israeli right to be there, and we were sat listening to him getting very angry, and I had a very powerful spiritual experience that said to me, this is a man that wants to be a good man. And I sat with it, and it enabled me to cross that barrier towards him, to really see him as somebody who wanted to be a good man. It was powerful. The second experience was a few years ago, about 2019, I went down to campaign against the arms trade. There's an arms fair that takes place every 2 years in the Excel Centre where they wheel in tanks and missiles and weapons of all sorts, and they invite all the repressive regimes across the world to come and have a look at the weapons and see what they want to buy. And there's a campaign to oppose it. And I was there as part of, on the Faith Day, it was a week long of activities, and I was there with probably about 300 Quakers. I think Alison might have been there as well. And we were holding a meeting for worship. So we were blocking the road to the entrance, and we were holding a meeting for worship. And I've done a lot of demonstrating, so I can talk to you about police and how the police operate. And this was different, because the police came in and immediately wanted us to move from the road and said that we would be arrested if we didn't move. But we were in the middle of a meeting for worship, and somebody said to them, you know, can we finish our meeting for worship? It will be another half an hour or so. And they completely ignored it. They wouldn't engage with us at all and kept issuing this message about you'll be arrested if you don't move. And I was really conflicted. Good word. The Spirit was present in the meeting for worship, but I did not want to be arrested. Just because it would have, it was complicated. What train would I get home? Who would I ring? Who would I process? And it was a spiritual experience for me in that process. So that's my peace testimony.
So we're each going to now say something about peace education in the Quaker context. And my piece is a statement about prophesying and reconciling, which I'll explain. Some might think that it's a Quaker thing to never take sides. And among Quakers nationally at the moment, there's a lot of thinking going on about how one can be a peacemaker while feeling passionate about the injustice suffered by a particular side in conflicts such as those in Gaza and Ukraine. Can it be ethical to respond to evildoing with silence and neutrality? Quakers have been discussing this issue throughout their history, and one Quaker thinker has identified two patterns of response, which he called prophesying and reconciling. These two concepts were explored in depth in the 1970s by Wolf Mendel in his book Prophets and Reconcilers, Reflections on the Quaker Peace Testimony. And these two concepts, or you might say roles, have recently been brought to the fore again in an article in the National Quaker Journal, and some of us have been finding this really helpful. So we've decided to bring this to the Lent group for you to share in our reflections. Prophets, reconcilers, two valid callings. So a lot of what I'm going to say now is quoted from this article, which has been great food for thought for all of us. And so I'll name the author. It's John Lampen, who incidentally worked as a mediator in Derry in the late 1980s to early 90s and played a significant part in the IRA's journey to the 1994 ceasefire. So people who are called to be prophets identify something which is wrong and speak out clearly against it. They do not feel it is their role to be neutral. However, some Quakers are currently really struggling with this role because in speaking out about some current wrongs, they're finding themselves at odds with a lot of mainstream media and, in fact, our government's own line sometimes. So there are Quaker guidelines for this prophetic role. Namely, we must look for that of God in the oppressors. And then we must engage with that by telling the truth. Whilst speaking out against oppression, we must not demonize the oppressors, but endeavour to acknowledge whatever positive values are to be found in them. We should not attribute motives without clear evidence, and we should try to understand the pressures which make them behave as they do. Reconcilers. Reconcilers are not passively neutral, they are healers. They look for that of God in the adversaries on both sides, and for common ground on which all can meet and find agreement and hopefully put the past behind them. Reconcilers listen intently to the thoughts, feelings and beliefs of all, in order to discern unconsidered possibilities, to perhaps reframe things in a way which will shed new light on the issues at stake, and to reach out to people's essential goodness, whatever their actions. Prophets, reconcilers. Is that two personality types? Is it a kind of spectrum with one at either end? So I'm just going to now give you no more than 2 minutes to tell each other on your tables which you think you are or where you are on the spectrum. 2 minutes. Yeah, wobbling in, yes. Good. They've had 40 seconds. I'm going to be strict. You have 1 more minute. Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. Done. All right. That really was meant to be just 2 minutes, just to give you pause to just try to place yourselves, because that's actually a big discussion, really. But so I was in a Quaker group where we did that, and then at the end it's like, put your hand up if you're a reconciler, put your hand up if you're a prophet. And I'm not going to ask that question here, because what happened then with people were saying, oh, but sometimes that and sometimes that, and so what I expect is yes, that you vacillate. We all do different things in response to different circumstances and different contexts, and so so I shall continue. I shall sum this up with the following words. So both roles are important aspects of Quaker witness, and both are necessary. It's been suggested that each of us has both these voices inside us, sometimes in painful tension. But generally, we can't simultaneously take both paths. We have to make a choice. And of course, there are other ways of contributing to peace, through disseminating information about the true situation, through giving material help to those who are suffering, or through supporting local peacemakers. So I leave that with you. Who's next? John.
Well, thank you, Sue. I'm going to be talking about the way in which we handle, as individuals and as groups, conflict. So we've thought about the peace testimony that Quakers hold as a peace church, and how individual responses to events can differ, and sometimes acting as prophets, at other times as reconciler. One of our Quaker advices is, bring into God's light those emotions, attitudes, and prejudices in yourself which lie at the root of destructive conflict, acknowledging your need for forgiveness and grace. In what ways are you involved in the work of reconciliation between individuals, groups, and nations? So now we're going to take a look inside ourselves at our reactions to dealing with conflict. Now, conflict is a normal part of life. We each have our own way of dealing with it, which is influenced by our temperament, our personality, our environment, our age, and the like, and perhaps even what side of bed we got out of. But if we recognize our default conflict management style, we can understand the impact it has on the way that we approach conflict. And if we are aware of all the various styles that are available to us, we can choose the most appropriate way of dealing with conflict, a conflict perhaps in which we're personally involved as one of the parties, or a conflict in which we're trying to mediate. Now, 5 different styles of conflict management have been identified. And as with prophets and reconcilers, there may be overlap in any particular case. And the first style that you have up there is collaborating. Each party values both their goals and the relationship. They view the conflict as a problem to be solved. They listen to each other and creatively explore each other's position. And the shared aim is for each party to achieve their goals. Now, this does take time and energy, but it builds trust and positive relationships. At the other end of the scale, and we talked about this on our table, there is walking away, avoiding the conflict. Now, this isn't always a bad thing. Avoidance may be appropriate at a point in time when resolution is impossible, or someone else is better placed to help resolve it. But it may also be because we fear hurting others or getting hurt ourselves. We may value avoiding confrontation more than either our goals or our relationships. We think subconsciously, is it easier to withdraw from a conflict than to face it? The danger is that avoidance and withdrawal from a conflict may just put off the evil day, and unresolved conflict may fester. And this is something that I think quite often happens in domestic situations. Now, it may be our personal default mode, and one of the questions I'd like just to pose to you is it? Is it yours? Is it mine? Is it your personal default mode? Now, if we accept that our own goals may not be met, if we're happy to lay those down, we may accept accommodating. What is at issue may be much more important to the other party than it is to us. Perhaps you value the relationship more highly than your own goals. There are times when that may be quite valid. Relationships may be maintained if you are the party making the accommodation. But if the accommodation is forced, it can be seen as bullying, and an unjust settlement conceded by a weaker party can breed resentment, which in national or international situations, as we have heard in our discussion, may last for generations. Which brings us round to competing. This is when one party knows what the answer is, knows what it wants, either to meet its own goals or to settle the dispute quickly. Its own interests or perceptions are paramount, regardless of the impact on other parties. It may be used when one party is operating from a position of power or rank, or expertise, or persuasive ability. Now, it can be appropriate in emergencies, or to defend people who are being exploited, but it can leave people feeling bruised, unsatisfied, and resentful if it's used in less urgent situations. And I think we can all think of international situations which fit that bill. Now, if a settlement that ticks all of everyone's boxes is hard to find, then compromising may be necessary. Everyone has to give up a bit of their own goals in the interest of a solution that partially suits all. If a compromise can come from generosity on all sides, relationships can be largely maintained. So if we look at the chart now, we can see in the left-hand column that in a conflict, avoiding or competing does not build strong relationships. If we look at the bottom row, we can see that avoiding or accommodating fails to meet the goals of at least one of the parties. Compromise in the middle gets some of the way there and may be the best achievable at that point in time. The risk is that it leaves unfinished business that may fester. And the winner, which is the hardest, generally speaking, collaborating, is in the top right-hand corner because it is win-win. The outcome satisfies both parties, from conflict to peace. Now, a few minutes to reflect individually on the following questions, and perhaps you who are watching this at home can do the same. What do you see as the potential advantages and disadvantages to each of these conflict approaches? Is there anything missing? Have a think about your conflict approach in relation to different contexts you have experienced or can imagine experiencing. Picture a family argument, an online disagreement, witnessing someone being racially abused in public, a workplace disagreement with a manager. And thirdly, what conflict tendency, competing, compromising, avoiding, accommodating, or collaborating, is your default position? Which would you like to try out more of in your life, and how can you move there? And you have a couple of minutes for that.
Okay, friends, I think we've had 2 minutes and appreciate it's frustrating, perhaps for some tables, but I think other tables I've noticed are not having the conversations, so for another time. Okay. Conflicts are inevitable and must not be repressed or ignored, but worked through painfully and carefully. We must develop the skills of being sensitive to oppression and grievances, sharing power in decision-making, creating consensus, and making reparations. That's a statement of the yearly meeting, the Quaker yearly meeting of Aotearoa, New Zealand, made in 1987. And it's in our Quaker Faith and Practice book. We're sharing this peace education with you because we've all received more peace education being part of Quakers than perhaps other people have. And when I've come across these ideas, I've thought, wow, they've changed my way of thinking. And I just feel like we need to be rolling out peace education. People need to hear more of the very clever people who've thought it through and understood things. So, this is a definition about violence. Violence is any behaviour, attitude, policy, or condition that diminishes, dominates, or destroys ourselves, other people, and or other living things. It's a statement that Quakers have put together. You might disagree with it. It's lots of opportunity for discussion within it. Violence can be physical, emotional, verbal, institutional, structural, cultural, or spiritual. I was sharing this presentation with somebody last week, and she said, "Oh, I don't really like the word violence." She said, "Why have you chosen the word violence? Couldn't you just use the word abuse?" And I feel like it's important to use the word violence because what we see as violence is the physical action of somebody becoming aggressive. And we can start at that point of this person becoming aggressive and we can see them as the violent one. But we've not seen the behaviours that have been imposed on the other person that are equally violent and that have precipitated the actual act of physical aggression. And it's really important that we understand that, and people have raised it already this evening, so I feel like I'm amongst a group of people who think about these things. So we all can understand what physical violence is. I think we can understand emotional violence now as a society. We understand much more about domestic abuse and domestic violence and what's it called, coercive control, and the kind of, and we can talk about children being emotionally abused, experiencing emotional violence, and we all understand verbal aggression as well. Institutional is a bit more difficult, isn't it? What's institutional violence? I'm not standing here with all the answers. I'm honestly not. It can be the way that things are organised within an institution, so that some people feel disadvantaged by it. Our friend talked about languages in South Africa, and how English and Afrikaans were the main language. And so people's own language, first language, was disrespected and not valued as a legitimate means of communication. And I would say that's institutional violence, one example of institutional violence. Structural violence, again, people have argued about it. What does it mean? And I would say that structural violence is, for me, and I'm just talking for me, it's about inequality in our society. It's about the fact that people born in poverty do not have the same advantages that people not born in poverty have, and that their lives can become more and more disadvantaged as they try to manage a society that is structured around those with more advantages and with more privileges. Cultural violence. What does cultural violence mean? And again, one of the examples that I was taught was you've got a work group who, a group of people at work who spend Monday to Friday working really, really hard, and every Friday evening they go for a meal and a drink after work to cement their relationships and to kind of ease the working pressures. Sounds brilliant, doesn't it? But if you're Jewish and your Sabbath is on the Friday night and you want to be part of your Sabbath family, that can feel like cultural violence to you. You're kind of disenfranchised from the ongoing dialogue of that working group. And it might be that you don't go to your Sabbath meal, but you go to the work group, but you're never comfortable in either because you've been presented with an unacceptable situation that if people thought more about it, they wouldn't place you in. Spiritual one's a big one, isn't it? I don't know if I'm going to talk about spiritual violence. I did a course on spiritual abuse last year, and it was very powerful to hear what the church is Church of England, because it was Church of England Network, is beginning to understand about spiritual abuse and the way it talks about it, and can be said to be kind of using the Bible to give somebody a judgmental message, a shaming message, a not belonging message. So using their faith and their belief in God and their respect for the Bible, in a sense, to give them a harmful message. And I think that's spiritual, but we need more discussion about it. Peacemaking. It's about finding ways to interrupt injustice without mirroring it. We had it up before, but it feels like a good, useful place to finish. So, open to Sue is going to facilitate any questions to any of us.
Thank you so much. I think my role is purely to sort of try and field your questions, your thoughts, your comments on what any of our three speakers have said. I just think it's been an incredibly helpful and deep and thought-provoking, series of, they're all quite different, very interesting, lots to think about. So, but the whole idea behind these sessions is for us to learn together, to understand more about the whole subject of peace, peacemaking, peacekeeping, peace building. What can we do to bring peace into our world, into our relationships, into the communities where we are? And there's been so much we've learned already tonight, but there's more to learn from sharing thoughts and asking questions. So we now have about 15 minutes when we can do that. So what I'd like to suggest, so Stephen and I think will probably work together as a